The Ki-48 brings a guided missile into Rank 2 in War Thunder. Let's check it out. Historically, the Ki-48 was a bit of an oddball aircraft. In the late 1930s, the Japanese military had put out a request for a high-speed light bomber, mostly following the vogue in bomber design at the time, which theorized that a small and fast bomber could outrun interceptors that were sent up after it. The resulting design was fairly conventional for the time, combining a slender fuselage with twin radial engines, and at first it seemed promising after the initial prototyping, but its shortcomings quickly became obvious after it entered service. It carried a very light bomb load, smaller than some single-engine fighters like the P-47 would carry later in the war. Plus, its defensive armament was limited by the fuselage design. To make matters worse, single-engine fighter design advanced very rapidly at the start of World War II, so by the time it entered service, there were already fighters capable of matching or exceeding its maximum speed, which mitigated the primary intended advantage. The Ki-48 ended up being used mostly in theaters where enemy air support was limited, but it remained in service until the end of the war simply due to the lack of available replacements. The plane was a workhorse though, and it ended up being used as a testbed for the NE-0 turbojet engine and the Ki-148 air-to-surface missile. The Ki-148 was the most mature and reliable of Japan's guided munitions that were produced during the war, and according to primary sources, it suffered far less development problems than the larger Ki-147. The operational testing was mostly successful, but controlling the missile was done manually and it required a lot of practice to actually hit targets. While the Ki-148 itself was considered ready for combat and over 150 were built, none were actually used operationally before the war ended. What we're looking at in War Thunder is the Ki-48-II Otsu, a frontline bomber in Rank 2 of the Japanese air tree with a battle rating of 2.3. This is one of the prizes from the Fall 2023 crafting event. As a premium aircraft, it comes fully upgraded. Being a low-tier prop bomber, the Ki-48 doesn't get any advanced combat systems, and as of making this review, it does not have an optical bomb sight. The bomber does get two defensive gun turrets facing backwards, on the top and bottom of the fuselage. For loadouts, the plane gets fairly basic selections of dump bombs, or its guided missile. Again, being a premium vehicle, all of these are unlocked by default. Now, the two bombs it carries are fairly basic, low-yield, 50 and 100 kilogram general-purpose high-explosive bombs. The damage caused by these individually is very small, and the larger of the two only has a 5-meter blast radius. The main attraction, though, is the Ki-148 Model 1B missile. This is a manual command line-of-sight guided weapon that has a pretty unique flight profile, but reasonably large warhead and a respectable armor penetration value on a direct hit. If you need a refresher on how to control manual command line-of-sight weapons, I'll put a link in a pinned comment to my complete guide to air-to-ground weapons in War Thunder, but I'll be talking about the Ki-148 specifically in a minute. The flight performance of the Ki-48 is fairly typical of a low-tier twin-engine light bomber, with a few caveats. Its rate of climb is okay, but it does have a good top-end speed for a bomber in this BR bracket. The bad news is that the top-end speed is only average for fighters in this BR bracket, so your ability to use its speed as an advantage, even up at an appropriate altitude, is limited by the ability of single-engine fighters to usually climb above you and dive in with an energy advantage. One silver lining of sorts is that this bomber's actually pretty agile, and it has reasonably good maneuverability after you drop its ordnance. But, like most other bombers in this class, its overall flight performance is dramatically reduced by its weapon load. Taking the Ki-148, which is mounted externally, is especially noteworthy as it introduces not only a lot of weight, but a significant amount of parasite drag, and it brings the plane's performance way down into the below average category until you deploy the missile. Another thing to remember is that despite having a surprising amount of agility for a bomber, its energy retention in maneuvers is really awful, and if you're forced into defensive flying against a fighter, you're going to find yourself at a really low airspeed very quickly. Taking the Ki-48 into air battles isn't usually this plane's strong suit. As of making this video, it doesn't have an optical bomb sight, which I have complained to the devs about. But unless they add one, you're forced to do blind bombing at very low altitude if you want any hope of accurate drops, which makes it not especially well suited for base grinding or farming AI ground units. Both of your bomb loads are fairly light and usually won't destroy a base in one pass unless you get a down tier. In case you're curious, the Ki-148 missile does about a quarter of a base worth of damage. The other thing to mention is that the defensive gunners are almost useless. The low-caliber machine guns and fields of view that are basically just directly backwards put a serious limit on how effective they can be. Even with a fully ace crew, your gunners will rarely do anything for you. In arcade battles, you get the CCIP for your bombs, so this ends up being a fairly typical low-tier light bomber, and you can use it successfully to mop up ground units. But just remember, the gunners are still pretty useless, and you're vulnerable to attacks from basically every direction except directly behind you. Now, in terms of close air support, again, without an optical bomb sight, you're forced into high-risk, low-altitude blind drops if you want to use the dumb bombs. No matter what anyone says, this is more luck than skill, and all of this plane's bombs have pretty low yields with a small blast radius, so it'll be difficult to get kills reliably. This brings us to the Ki-148. Now, I'm gonna say up front that this thing is incredibly difficult to use. It flies really slow, it's got a wonky flight trajectory, you usually get some weird parallax view angles making it hard to judge the altitude and distance of the weapon, and if you're not super careful, you can fly it outside of your field of view pretty easily. Now, the best tactic I've personally found is to fire the missile and then slow down, letting it get out ahead of you for a couple of seconds, then fly behind it and zoom in while you steer the weapon. Just remember though, this leaves you incredibly vulnerable to attack as you're literally tunnel visioned. Using the Ki-148 in naval battles lets you do standoff attacks against enemy ships that are usually going to be outside the range of their anti-aircraft guns. At least outside the range they can fire accurately. But the missile itself might not sink a larger ship in one hit depending on where it impacts. You can easily take out a compartment and do major damage, but you might not get kill credit until much later unless they were already beat up when you hit them. You can sink light coastal boats in one hit though, and you can even do really heavy damage on a near miss. Visually, I'd like this plane a lot more if it had bomb bay doors. Even with bombs instead of the missile, the belly of your plane is wide open, which looks pretty silly, but who knows, maybe they'll update it later. Otherwise, it's a pretty basic looking twin-engine light prop bomber. No fancy paint jobs or anything yet. Landing is pretty easy, but just remember to keep your throttle up a bit on final. This thing has a tendency to drop like a brick once you get below around 180 kilometers an hour. You can safely drop gear and landing flaps at about 250. The cockpit is exactly what you expect. It's a placeholder, but it's actually not too bad in terms of the visual detail and stuff. Probably one of the better looking placeholder cockpits in the game. The visibility isn't very good, but nobody would expect it to be. To close out on the Ki-48. This plane gets a guided missile in rank 2, and it gets premium bonuses. However, as of making this review, it doesn't get an optical bomb sight, its defensive guns are a joke, and its overall bomb load is really weak. The final verdict on the Ki-48-II Otsu event vehicle is that this plane is really just a carrier for the Ki-148 manually guided missile. Using it effectively and reliably is going to have an enormous learning curve, but it's the lowest rank guided weapon in the game, so there's certainly a lot of novelty value. If you can get good with the missile, you'll love this plane. As always, thanks for watching.